Okay, and this first part will be a little more question about today's great presentation, the keynote speech. Second part will be general questions, which is happening these days. Okay, and you made an analogy of a solar system, yeah, about the current or past international monetary system, and that's your original invention or creation, or
Yes.
yeah.
Yes, that analogy is what I've used. Yes.
And I don't remember that you made the analogy before in Korea, so it's duly invented kind of examples.
Yes, I think I have used it before in certain times. But
Certain times.
But at certain times, but not.
Not many
When
times.
when it was relevant, because the global monetary system of countries interacting with one another obeys some laws that have some analogies to the solar system.
Right.
There's a coherence that makes them work.
I see.
And what I was emphasizing here was the fact that in the period of the gold standard, then gold was like the center of gravity for the system. It gave and people who fixed their monies to gold had a kind of stability that was given to it by gold itself.
Stability.
But then as the dollar, the U.S. economy becomes bigger, heavier than the gold in the world, it outweighs it, and it becomes the center of attraction rather than the dollar. So that before, let's say before the 1930s, or at least in the 19th century, countries would fix to gold, and many countries were fixed to it, and then that would determine their price level. But by 1934, when other countries had gone away from gold, and it was mainly only the United States, and it was the U.S. fixed to gold, but it wasn't gold determining the price level, it was the U.S. dollar system determining the price of gold. It was a reversal of the strength. The big country can fix to a little country, but a small country can fix to a small country can fix its currency to a big country and get the inflation of the big rate of the big country, its price level of the big country. But a big country can't fix to a little country, it gives the price level to it.
I see. Okay. So the instability of the current system comes from a sort of a floating or floating exchange rate system, especially the volatility, the increase and decrease of exchange rate can be thought of as a source of crisis.
Well, you have to remember that throughout history, there's been, for 2,500 years, there's been a kind of fixed exchange rate system because all countries were using one or the other of the precious metals.
Okay.
So there was a unity in prices based on the fact that gold or silver was the commodity. But then when the countries, after the revolution, the 20th century revolution, was that the whole world went off metallic currencies. The U.S. was the last to go off in 1971. But so it had the last one, and it kept the reputation of gold. So the dollar was, even though gold was no longer lit, it was like it was the ghost of gold, as some people would say. It was the ghost of gold, what used to be there. Gold was the symbol of stability. The 1944 gold dollar was identified with the gold itself. And then the dollar became identified as the anchor of stability. It became big, and that was why after it broke up, the system didn't change as much as people thought, because a lot of countries still kept their currencies fixed to the dollar. But what changed things in starting in the 1970s and then the 1980s and 90s was the fact that Europe, when the world went on to flexible exchange rates, Europe didn't want any part of flexible exchange rates. They wanted to, if they're not fixed to the dollar, then they're going to fix to each other. And to form their own bloc, a big bloc, and they did. They formed the European monetary system, and then they created the euro. And then once the euro was created, it was now, you had a very clear-cut relationship, the dollar and the euro. These were now the two big currencies out there with no clear center of gravity, because it's the U.S. dominated before, but now the U.S. is a money weight or GDP of $16 trillion, but the euro area has a weight of 14 trillion. So it's very little difference. They're like two equal things. And if Britain had gone into the euro area, it would have been even larger than the American. So it ends up that now you've got two currencies out there, and in matters of money, that can be worse than having one. Because if there's one, then you have a common single unit of account in the world, and that's great from the standpoint of efficiency of information and so on. But if you have two, and they're not fixed together, they're fluctuating up and down, then you get a kind of confusion. It's like, take any stock market, take the New York stock market, give it two currencies. What a massive confusion it would be. Because you'd have people wouldn't know, it would just create chaos in the whole markets. So now there's the big problem comes that if countries fix to the dollar now, like China, which more or less fixes it, and then the dollar moves against the euro, then this has big implications for China. When the dollar became very strong in 2008, that's when China imported the world crash, the world system. It wasn't so devastating to China, but it was still very painful to China compared to what had been before. And it wasn't because the dollar RMB rate changed, because the dollar euro rate changed, and therefore the RMB euro rate changed. And Europe is one of China's biggest customers.
I see. So the Euro bloc, dollar bloc, and the yen bloc, yuan bloc, and there are three blocks, and the last part of your presentation was three blocks, and the three currencies fixed each other. Then it can be helpful to the stability.
This is a little bit, in a way, like in the 1980s, 1990s, people were suggesting, well, now the three currency areas in the world are the dollar, euro hadn't existed, but there was still the Deutsche Mark leading. The dollar and the yen.
Yen at the
time. Deutsche Mark. These were the three big currencies in the world. And you could have unified the world by doing that, with that part, using the yen. But now, after the 1980s, Japan really doesn't want to get involved correctly in fixing to the dollar again, because it got into trouble in the 1980s, and the U.S. sort of forced them to bash them, as they were saying, into appreciating the yen, and that did a lot of harm to the Japanese economy. So they didn't go. But so now anyway, the China area has overtaken the yen area in size, but it's not of course a convertible currency. So it hasn't been accepted yet by the IMF as one of the four currencies in the SDR. These four currencies that are in the SDR, the special drawing rights, are the dollar, the euro, the yen, and the British pound. Even though, but the RMB has a bigger weight than either the yen or the pound, but because it's not convertible yet. So I guess now I know that China has been making suggestions that it's going to try to work for toward convertibility. This would be a major change.
Major change.
It would create a major change in China. It would be like a new generation of things in China, and it would have, along with it, it would be associated with financial reform and yes, financial opening up in a number of different ways. And it would, of course, give a great potential for a much higher standard of living in China when it's all done, but it would be also a kind of openness that would have, the government would have, in a sense, less control because they allow things to go free and they take steps not to interfere too much with the private sector.
Some Chinese people seem to be a little afraid of moving to the status of convertible currency because they should open the capital account.
Yes.
So today's in a session in the afternoon, one scholar from China said that he's against opening the capital account. So maybe there are some conflicts about that idea of being a fully convertible currency.
Yes, there's some
what's your opinion?
fears that it might be negative. It's a little bit, the experience of Europe can be brought into bear here because Europe really invented exchange control.
Right.
And all the European countries had exchange control after World War II.
World War II.
And Britain had them for 20 years, 25 years after World War II. Germany, a defeated country, was the first to really become a convertible currency. And it had strong growth and strong dynamism, and it became a convertible currency fairly early. And that worked well for Britain, but for the other countries, they were much later and more reluctant to do it. I think there's two things that have to be separated here. One is making the currency convertible, meaning a free exchange market. And the other thing is having a flexible exchange rate. People sometimes talk about the two as if they go together. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. But you could have a convertible currency. The Bretton Woods currencies were convertible, and they had fixed exchange rates. You could have a fixed exchange rate and a convertible currency. The only thing you would do is that you wouldn't have control over the capital account, and that would reduce the amount of control.
So
there's also the question. There's also the question what it mean. It would be a kind of convertibility. The removal of exchange control would be an empowerment for all those people in China who have wealth tied up in RMB assets, and probably a good many of them would want to hold part of their assets abroad. So they'd want to shift them abroad. But others, once it becomes free, would also want to bring some of them back to China. So, but initially, the first impact of it would be that people would want to take some abroad in case everything changed again. And there's also the issue when you have a completely convertible system, is the government has less information about it than when everything is tied up and you have to make applications of what you want to do, and it's a lengthy and not a very efficient process, but it does give the government more information about what's happening.
So any conjecture about the time for the full convertibility of renminbi or Vienna? Do you have any idea how long does it take, or will it take, in your opinion, for renminbi to be convertible?
It doesn't take very long to do it.
Oh, really?
It's just, you do it, but it's the question of now. My own view is that China would feel safest if it did it slowly. It kept making making new areas convertible and keep moving in that direction instead of saying all at once opening up like that. It would be too much of a shock. It might be. Now, I think a lot of people would prefer to do it that way. The Big Bang approach to economic, but I would do it. I would do it in steps, measurably, and look and see what happens after each one.
I see. Okay. Very interesting comments. Thank you. And maybe two or three more questions, and we cannot avoid asking you about Abenomics and the Japanese economic policy, and you can give us some opinion or about Abenomics or Japanese policy.
Well, the change in Japan is after a long period of time is with a long period of really zero inflation or negative inflation, a little bit of deflation, is to move now, use this crisis as an opportunity to move toward a new a positive inflation. 2% is the target rate of inflation. So the shift to that requires, of course, the complicity of the central bank.
Central bank.
And we have a new central bank governor, of course, very distinguished person.
Yeah,
He was the former Kuroda was the head of the Asian Development Bank, and then before that he was a vice minister, but a very outspoken vice minister, and it was a good, he's an able person. So he apparently will be the one that is doing it, and everybody's asking when it happens, what's going to be the effect upon, say, bond prices in Japan?
Bond prices.
If you have higher inflation, the Japanese have been content for 1.5% to 2% interest on bond prices when they had no inflation. But if they have, and some very often an appreciating a strong yen.
Right.
But if you move toward the case where you have a depreciating yen, then it will offset that, and bond prices should come down. But the last time that happened in a big way was in 1985. In 1985, that was at the time actually it was indirectly my suggestion to have this Plaza Accord.
Oh, really?
I talked to Richard Darman, the secretary, and I made that proposal to him in June, early June of 1985, and the Plaza Accord in September.
Yeah, September.
The idea was for the United States wanted to get the dollar down. They wanted to depreciate the dollar. See, the United States is the only country in the world that can't depreciate the dollar if it wants to, in a way, because it didn't have, under the Bretton Woods, it had no control over. Every other country had control over their exchange rates, but there's always one country, the nth country, that didn't, and that was the United States. So the United States wanted to have an exchange rate policy, and there was a very clear-cut reason for that. I'll take a minute just to explain what it was. That in the late 1970s, the United States had too much inflation and they had a depreciating currency. And then they turned around they got a 13.5% rate of inflation in 1980. Then they turned around with Paul Volcker was the chairman and tightened. And that, along with Reaganomics, tax cuts to spur the economy, that was also part of my idea. And then the tight money to reduce the inflation rate. And but in the process, the dollar soared. It went up. It went up in the next 4 years. It doubled in the next 4 years. The way to calculate the way the dollar went, the best way is with the Deutsche Mark, representing the European currencies, which were tending to go with it. In 1975, the dollar was 3.5 Deutsche Marks.
3.5.
1980, 5 years later, it had fallen to 1.7
1.7.
Deutsche Marks. 5 years later, in 1985 or even 1984, the dollar had doubled to 3.4 or 5 Deutsche Marks again. It went back, you see. Now, when that came about because the tight money on the part of the Fed, plus the tax cuts that kept the economy rolling, and that was my policy mix I've always pushed. But then the result was what was getting the inflation rate down, it came down from 13.5% in 1980 to 4%. 1984. What was doing this was the appreciating currency. But when the inflation rate got down to, let's say, 4% was good enough, or 3 was good enough, at that point, the currency was overvalued because it had done its job in getting the inflation rate down and grinding it down. But then you have to have a quick devaluation. You have to get it back again. Every country in the world, I've looked at dozens of countries in the world when this has happened, after they've tightened, and it's the exchange rate that does the disinflation. But then at the end, you have to bring the exchange rate back to equilibrium. But Brazil did that. Brazil did the same thing. They brought the inflation rate down to 35% a month. They brought it down to that's so much per year, but they brought it down to one single-digit levels, and then they were happy with it. But then they had to cut the real by 40%. They had a devaluation of the real. They could do it, but the U.S. couldn't do it. See, the U.S. there was no lever the U.S. could put to devalue the dollar. They had to get the G5 together to get. Now there was no G5 then, but I had in this conversation I had with Richard Darman, and he asked me, well, which countries should we get together? And I said, well, you want to keep it a small group. The best group would be the G7, but you can make it smaller than that because you don't need to have Italy in it, and you don't need to have Canada in it, because these were not big players in the exchange markets. So just make it the G5, and that was what. Those G5 were in fact the SDR powers, because each one of those countries had its currency in the SDR. Britain, France, and Germany, and in Japan and the United States. So it was a G5. It was an SDR group. That G5 at that time. That was why I proposed that. Now later on, that had an embarrassing consequence because the G5 meeting came. Then a year and a half later, in February 1987, there was a G7 meeting. And it was in Paris. The Louvre was the meeting, and the G5 group, they said, let's have our meeting. The SCR group, let's have our meeting now and make our decisions, and then bring Canada and Italy on board, and then we'll make it a G7 announcement. It was okay for Canada, but Italy said, what? You mean we're just a rubber stamp? So they refused to sign, and for that was his historic element. And I have to take a little blame for it because I suggested not Italy or Canada, and it became, for the first time, there was a G6 decision. They had a G6 decision because it was the G7 without Italy.
That's Louvre Accord.
The Louvre Accord. And that was, at that time, the yen had gone up enough. At the time of the Plaza meeting, September 22nd, 1985, the dollar was 239 yen. In round numbers, like 240. And then at this time, the yen had dropped from the dollar had dropped from 240 to 1 65.
160.
And that was at that time. Now later it went even further. It went down to 120
went further,
and then
yeah.
further on. But
I see. So that was a famous plaza, and your advisor, your reporter.
this was in
Yeah.
this took place on a car because Richard Darman was the undersecretary of the Treasury. There was a conference in Bermuda, and I was at one of the speakers at the conference, and so was Darman. But Darman had come. He gave his speech, and then he had to go back. He had to catch his plane back. So I went back in the airport with him, and we had this meeting on the way. I took him along with the host to the airport, and this was what how this conversation came.
Very interesting episode. And okay, so the Japanese economy seemed to be recovering from the worst situation, but do you think that it can revive again, or there are some worries still?
It's not. It's a change from things. So it's what hasn't happened yet. I'm maybe not following it closely enough, but there hasn't been that drop in the bond market. There hasn't been much. What you've got, though, of course, is you've got a drop in the value of those bonds in other currencies. So the yen has gone down. So you haven't got the drop. You'd expect a drop in the bond market and interest rates go up, but instead you've reduced the value of them in terms of all foreign currencies by the depreciation. So now the yen is instead of around 80, it's now sort of 95 or so. And it may be getting up to 100. I don't know.
103 or something.
Oh, is it? Is it? Oh,
103.
No, it's been there before.
It
was there back in about the year 2000.
So depreciation is helpful to Japanese economy as of now.
It's got to be helpful to the Japanese exporters. Helpful to them, but of course it reduces the foreign exchange or the dollar value of their assets, of their financial assets in Japan. And the Japanese debt, is 250% of GDP. So the GDP of Japan is about 5. This is like $12 trillion of assets, and they've gone down in dollar terms.
Okay. Maybe final question. I read a paper, and the IMF forecast about euro area next year is positive. The growth rate estimates or forecast is positive. So
for Europe,
for Europe next year. So if that's right, it means that the bottom is this year, and next year it will grow up again. Will start growing up again. So do you think that that kind of recovery is possible for European areas or eurozones?
I think it is. I think it is possible. It's the problem is that it could have setbacks. The setbacks, like there was one setback that bothered me. I've always thought that Europe should try to keep its currency low, because a high euro worsens the budget deficits, makes the situation worse. So when but the U.S. but the European Central Bank can't go out into the market and drive down the euro against the dollar by buying dollars and pushing down without creating a big problem with the Federal Reserve, because this will look like deliberate depreciation, bigger my neighbor policies, and that's not a good thing. But when the euro had got down down at around $1.21 at the time of the QE3, when QE3 was announced, I think the Europeans could have very well said, we don't want the euro to appreciate against the dollar. QE3, we don't want to be harmed by QE3. For defensive reasons, we want to keep the euro down at this around 120 or 122, something like that. And even if we had to buy up American assets to keep them down, or expand the money supply, they have to watch it. They're not allowed to create within their mandate inflation. But this doesn't have to be inflation because the euro was already at $1.20. The market had put it at $1.20, and I don't think that I think that Europe should have just tried to hold it there. And if that had happened, I think they wouldn't have had that setback with the secondary recession that far back to negative growth. What happened? You see, the euro started to soar. It went up over $1.30, then it went up to $1.37. Then the Europe took action to try to talk it down and try to get it down again, but it was too late. They should have tried to keep it down and then keep it at a low level for a year or 2 or 3 years like that until they get out of improve the deficit position and start to get growth going in Europe, and that would be all right too. And that would not have hurt Germany at all, because after all, Germany also was penalized by this. Germany had a setback too. It went into negative growth. There's no reason for Germany. So the exchange rate would have been much better if they could have kept it where it was.
So a weak euro for the time being will be helpful for the recovery. Okay.
And by the way, and this is also especially true at a time when Japan is depreciating its currency. So Japan's getting more competitive. And why should the Europeans make itself? It's come so uncompetitive at a time when they're in one of the biggest crisis the euro area has ever had.
Okay. One final question about Korean economy, and as you know, we have $330 billion foreign exchange reserve, and China also has $3.3 trillion of foreign exchange reserve. Sometimes I think that if the monetary system or international monetary system is sort of very stable, then we don't have to accumulate that much foreign exchange reserve compared with our GDP or the size of the economy. So any suggestion for the new architecture for
does Korea would Korea want to get rid of those dollars? Would it rather it didn't have the dollars?
We have a foreign exchange reserve.
You don't want. Yeah, I know, but you bought it. You bought that.
Yeah, we just used the money to buy a treasury bond or.
You didn't have to buy it. You chose to buy it.
You chose to accumulate.
You don't have a fixed exchange rate.
You don't have a fixed
You don't have a fixed exchange rate, but nevertheless, you went in the market and you bought the currency. So you must have wanted the currency, otherwise you wouldn't have bought it. Eh?
Right. Yeah, that's our choice.
So you weren't forced to buy it. You bought it. You chose to buy it, and I would assume that Korea wants that extra currency. And I think it's probably good that China has it. In fact, the world as a whole, without not even excluding China, wants more reserves. This is the paradox in a way. Yes, China has this whopping amount of currency, but it's not held in dollars. It's not held in
not
cash.
Just in dollars.
It's been sorted out.
Yeah.
They have a billion, 1.2 or so. I don't know what it is now. About 1.2 billion in government bonds.
Yeah, trillion.
And they haven't sold those. They haven't, and they're buying those. And the fact is that buying dollars has been the way in which China has been able to grow and have this foreign direct investment that it gets without becoming a debtor. So it's the only country in the world that has managed to have this enormous increase in investment and capital assets without going into debt. The Americans, the other countries in the world all ended up going into debt. They were debtors.
Debtors.
America was a big debtor before World War One, and then suddenly World War One changed that factor. But China has done this without, and the instrument by which they did it was to buy dollars. Korea, I think, and Taiwan also keeps large quantities of, and Japan has over $1 trillion.
Yeah, $1 trillion.
Maybe as much as $1.5 trillion. I don't know.
Trillion.
But they all want dollars, and that's an asset they have. Of course. So that's the good side. The system is working beautifully. I mean, just imagine if it's not an explicit system. Nobody organized it or said that's the way it is. But it's as if the U.S. is the world central bank. And the other countries want reserves, and the U.S. wants to buy assets and put in more reserves there because of its own economy. It's doing it for its own economy. But it's good for the world at this time in this deleveraging crisis. It's a way of overcoming the deleveraging part of the crisis, getting countries to get out of debt. So it's doing a good job. Some people are worried that it might not be good for the United States. At some point, these assets may create too much excess liquidity all at once and create some inflationary pressure. I acknowledge that could be a problem in the future, but the current problem is it's important to go on and proceed on at least for another year anyway. I think that Bernanke is probably right to go ahead for another year on this thing. But this system, can you imagine any kind of monetary system that you would put in a blueprint and make a plan of that would let one country, China, within a decade, acquire nearly $4 trillion of reserves. 40% of the whole reserves are never before. I mean, you couldn't do it under the gold standard. There was never enough. You couldn't get gold without taking away from other countries in a big way and creating a big problem. So you have a very elastic system, and it's working beautifully for China. I think it's working very well for Asia. And for some of the for the Gulf states and other countries that have been using it. It's it's a good system, but it's using a country's national currency as its reserve. Now this is these dollars that people are acquiring are reserves, and they're debts. They're debts of the U.S. Federal Reserve. But they're not going to be repaid. They're not redeemable in anything. It's not like the old gold standard where these notes were redeemable in gold. So they're like a fiat money out there. It's a fiat monetary system, and it's as if the U.S. is the world central bank. And it may well be working better than any other system we've invented, but it may have dangers to it. Maybe it's got political implications we might not like. But what I would love to find a system that would replace it. The big problem I have with the system isn't so much that the dollar reserves are out there; it's that the swings in the dollar-euro exchange rate are a big threat to stability of the system. That's why I have this plan for joining together the dollar and euro, fixing that rate. And because China is now the biggest holder by far of foreign exchange reserve of any country has ever had, China could be part of that system too and help in the process of stability. I think what we need to move toward, this is something I've just thought about recently. What we need to move toward is we need to have a little club, a club of 5 countries, to talk to each other about the implications of their monetary policies and exchange rates because of the way they interact. with an emphasis on not just money. Like I know BIS, Basel, they meet once a month and so on, but nothing comes out of that. It's not a. But this would be, it would take the U.S. Japan, the euro, and the pound, and China. These four, and then have the governors or deputy governors meeting at least periodically to evaluate the implications of just those five currencies, because these are the five currencies that have global importance. The pound sterling is the smallest of these, but still, pound has so many connections around the world. It's also a part of that, and should be there. And then you could meet in different centers every year, each of the five capitals or big cities. And I think talking about that, because right now the central bankers go to Basel, but they never talk about exchange rates. And exchange rates are part of the problem. The exchange rate is at the core of all of the four major crises, systemic crises that have occurred in that period. And they're each connected in some way with the dollar also. The dollar against the yen in the Asian crisis, the dollar against the euro in the last crisis.
Great. So that can be a new plaza group or something like that. Maybe China is included.
But add China to it.
Add China
again,
to that.
Again, we have to leave out Italy. Well, Italy will be now represented in as its share of the euro area. See, it'll have. It might be you might have an Italian, after all, is the head of the European Central Bank. Would be part of it.
So the new plaza group should be constructed and
redo the new plaza group and have periodic meetings of that group, including China as a full-fledged member, because even if its currency is not convertible, its currency policy is of relevance to the world now.
Wow, great comment and great ideas and thoughts.
You could call it something like the SDR Council. But China's not in the SDR yet. But it could be. China will be in it, and it could be.
Great idea and great thought. Thank you very much for the great conversation. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. I learned a lot from